Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I think it's at least 15 years since I was here last. So if you invite me again, I'll be well into my 70s by the time I come back. But it is a great pleasure to be here. I've been immensely helped particularly by the work of Professor Venema over the years. It's a delight to be. Maybe Mid-America would be the only reason it'd be a delight to be in Dyer, Indiana. But it is nice to be here. I want to speak today on the topic of what is man. Chosen this for a major reason. I think that so much of what's going on in the modern world around us, and to which the church is called to respond, touches on anthropology. If you look through church history, different phases of church history involve always, of course, teaching the whole counsel of God, but generally speaking, having to address particular issues as well. Each generation or each era produces its own particular issue where orthodoxy is under pressure. And if you look at the 4th, 5th century, we might say the doctrine of God or Christology are the keys. If we go to the Reformation, it is sacraments, authority, and salvation. I think in our own day and age, it's anthropology. It's the question of what does it mean to be a human being. Last year I gave a number of lectures and commented on the fact that 2023 was the 80th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's great little book, The Abolition of Man. I reread it at the start of 2023 and I was struck at how Lewis's book seems more relevant today than it would even have been when he originally gave those lectures in 1943, at the height, of course, of the Second World War. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, I think belongs to that small, rare category of books that have become more prophetic and more relevant as the years have gone by. And reading that book focused my mind on the fact that I think much of what we face today is connected to anthropology. Perhaps one of the most notorious questions of recent years, of course, has been the question, what is a woman? That grips the imagination. Most notoriously, of course, on this side of the Atlantic, it was when then prospective Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was asked to define woman in her Senate confirmation hearings. And she gave, of course, a terribly wrong answer to that. She said that she could not answer it because she was not a biologist. The last thing you want to say today is that being a woman has anything to do with biology. She gave a rather reactionary answer to that question, I thought. The most amusing example occurred, I think, on the other side of the Atlantic in my own homeland, when the Labour Shadow Minister for Women and Minorities was asked if she could define what a woman was and was unable to define the very category of people that she was meant to be representing the interests thereof. But we can be grabbed by that question and not realize that that question itself, I think, represents or rests upon a deeper confusion. And the deeper confusion is, what does it mean to be a human being? And I want to touch on something of that in these lectures. I also want to draw your attention to something that might lead us to perhaps panic or despair. The challenge to what it means to be a human being, or perhaps better, the challenges, have come with such speed, such comprehensive forms, and such radical forms, that there can be a feeling that we are plunging into the abyss with nothing to grab hold of and no way to respond. It is certainly the case that these changes have occurred rapidly and very, very fast. But what I want to argue in these lectures, particularly in the second lecture, is this, that actually we can boil these changes down to a number of points, all of which, when we identify them, all of which can be responded to by the church with tools that we already have. So, what I want to do in these two lectures, first of all, I want to help us grasp the genealogy and the dynamics of what has gone on, why anthropology has become such a big issue, such a problem in our current cultural climate. I want to remind us that we have the necessary resources for addressing this, and so there is no cause for panic. And perhaps perversely, I want to encourage you to think that the extremity of the times is generating some unusual and interesting conversations and some unexpected opportunities. So I do not wish to do the usual thing I do, and that is tell everybody how bad it is and it's going to get a whole lot worse before everything comes to an end. What I want to do is offer some grounds for hope and maybe even for cheerfulness at this point. We have a great gospel. Despite the consensus that's emerging, it seems, even in some Christian circles, the church is the answer. The only question is whether we are prepared to act consistently with those two truths. So, first of all, let's talk about the genealogy. The genealogy of what I call in my books the modern self. First of all, let me sort of dispel one criticism that I've received in numerous emails over the last few years. And the criticism runs something along these lines. Isn't what you're describing all down to sin? Why do we need to bother with all this history? On one level, it carries a certain amount of weight as a criticism. I had somebody, a number of people ask me, why didn't you begin the story with Descartes? A number of people asked me, why didn't you begin the story with late medieval nominalism? A number of people asked me, why didn't I begin the story with Eve in the garden? To which the answer to that one was easy. I wanted the book to be less than 10,000 pages long, and I wanted somebody to read it. Yes, there is a sense in which, the problem's sin. I would suggest, however, that in simply giving that answer, we speak the truth, but gain no real insight. The thought experiment I use in class when I teach historical method, I've taught it at seminary and now I occasionally teach it at Grove City College for my colleagues in the history department. The thought experiment I get students to engage in early in that course is this. Think of the statement, the Twin Towers fell down on 9/11 because of gravity. Is that a true statement or a false statement? The answer, of course, is it is a true statement. It is also a virtually useless statement, historically, because it really tells us nothing about what actually happened on 9/11. The reason, of course, is a simple one. General explanations that give an account of everything in general give us no account of anything in particular. It is always useful and indeed necessary when confronted with particular things to be able to offer particular explanations for them. And that, I think, would serve an important pastoral and apologetic function, of course, because knowing the specific shape of the problem we face allows us to engage that problem in a way that people might immediately resonate with. So I want to offer a number of observations on how we've got to where we are, not to deny the fact that, okay, yes, it's all down to sin, and as usual, society is marked by sin. I want to offer an explanation on the grounds of this allows us to know, if you like, the strategy of the enemy at this point, and to better respond to it. Well, the major genealogy, and I do not intend to spend too much time on this because you can read about it in my books, and frankly, I'm bored of recapitulating my books in lectures. I'm trying to do something different. The general intellectual genealogy is summed up with the terminology that I borrow from the philosopher Charles Taylor, expressive individualism. That what we live in today is a world where the normative understanding of what it means to be a human being, at least in the West, I make no assumption that this model applies in other parts of the world, but at least in the West, the normative understanding of what it means to be a human being can be summed up by the term expressive individualism. What does that term mean? Well, at its heart, it means this. The most important thing about us are our feelings. And it is our ability and capacity to express those feelings outwardly that makes us genuinely authentic. The language of authenticity is very important in this. It was interesting last year, I can't remember if it was the Oxford Dictionary or Merriam-Webster. Their word of the year was authentic. It lies very much at the heart of what it means to be a human being today. Am I able to be outwardly that which I am inwardly? That's quite a radical change in some ways from the way many of us were brought up. I grew up in England. I went to an all-boys grammar school. The purpose of an all-boys grammar school education was, by modern standards, precisely to make you inauthentic. You did not express your emotions. You made a joke out of suffering when it came your way. You never let your guard down. I joke to the students today, I'm emotionally two-dimensional, so do not expect a human response from me. Though I have to say, not having had daughters, I'm kind of vulnerable to women crying. A couple of years ago, I said, some student asked for an extension, and I said to her, no, and she said, would it make a difference if I cried? And I said, no. And I was lying, because I knew if she burst into tears, I'll give her anything she wants at this point. So, expressive individualism, where does it come from? Well, historically, I think we see it rising really in the 16th century. I don't go back this far in my books, but I've since, in the reading I've done after writing those books, become aware that the French essayist Montaigne is the first real literary example in the West of the man who uses the first person singular an awful lot. Montaigne's interest in his essays is with Montaigne. He starts to focus upon himself. At the same time, of course, we have the Reformation. And the Reformation places the individual and the individual's faith right at the center of what's going on in terms of salvation. We also have a little bit later the philosophy of Descartes, trying to ground certainty, grounding it ultimately in his own self-consciousness. So we see in the 16th and 17th century the emergence of an interest in the first person. Individuals, we might say, are becoming more significant and more important. When we move on into the 18th century, we come across a figure like Rousseau. And Rousseau's great emphasis when he writes his own Confessions, he says at the start of that, the only thing I need to do is to look within myself. And my life story is going to be the story of the inner psychological life of myself as I moved through this world. And Rousseau elaborates his thinking in such a way that feelings become very important. And as is the case with a lot of wrong teaching throughout history, it is made compelling because it is not entirely wrong. Rousseau makes a point somewhere that as soon as you have laws, you know something's gone wrong. Well, he's not entirely wrong about that. If I look out of this window now and I see a little old lady being beaten up by a gang of hooligans, and I have to Google, is that good or bad, right or wrong, what should I do? Then you'd have a word for me. I think the word would be sociopath, and it's a bad thing by and large. I should instinctively feel something bad is happening, even if I'm ignorant of the state law and federal law on the issue. So expressive individualism, as it develops in somebody like Rousseau, is not an entirely bad thing. Feelings are important. Feelings are important. But feelings become problematic when they're detached from any larger moral framework or when they come to determine that moral framework. And that's really what happens in the 19th century. Various assaults are made on the idea of human nature as possessing an objective moral structure or an objective moral end. And then at the end of the 19th and on into the 20th century, we have the figure of Sigmund Freud. Freud is the man who I think makes the, in some ways, again, move that is partially true, that sexual desire is very fundamental to who we are. And I think he's partially correct there. The example I use in class when I teach this stuff is, the Iliad. Why is it we can read the Iliad today and identify with what's going on? Well, at the heart of the Iliad, of course, is the damage, the disruption caused by misdirected sexual desire. Paris steals Helen from Menelaus. Menelaus gets together with his brother, sets sail with an army and goes and lays siege to the city of Troy for 10 years. That resonates with us because we know that sexual desire is powerful. And we know that sexual desire can do tremendously creative and tremendously damaging things within our society. What Freud does is take that and essentially make sexual desire the fundamental aspect of who we are. Again, you can draw a quick contrast between the way we think about sexual desire and the way the Bible talks about sexual desire. The Bible, there are seats if people want to come and squeeze in, or if people can squeeze down and open up some seats in the aisle, that might be useful. Bible generally deals with sex in terms of activity. Some sexual activities are correct, some are incorrect. The Bible does not typically deal with sexual desire in terms of identity. The categories of straight and gay do not appear on the pages of the Bible. Don't get me wrong, don't interpret me as saying the Bible has nothing to say to those identities. It does. But its primary concern is with sex as behavior. Only with Freud, only in the late 19th, early 20th century, does sex become identity. To bring that out, I remember a conversation I had probably 2-3 years ago now with a young man after I'd given a Sunday school on this kind of stuff. And a young man came up to me, I think he was 13 or 14. And it was one of those weird conversations that 10 years ago I would have never expected to have. Now I have these conversations and nothing registers in my face as it being strange at all. He said to me, well, I used to be bi, but it wasn't working for me, so now I'm straight. And as I continued the conversation with him, it became very clear to me that this young man had had no sexual experiences at all. He wasn't talking about his behavior. He was explaining or rationalizing the feelings and the desires that he felt. Well, only a modern person would do that. That would not have been possible, I think, in ancient Greece. I did classics. Yep, there was a lot of homosexual activity in ancient Greece. But I cannot think of a single ancient Greek person who identified themselves as gay or the Greek equivalent thereof. So, that sets up, if you like, the modern move inside, the emphasis upon feelings, and then the sexualization of those feelings. But that's only part of the story. That's the story that I deal with in the books. There are other things that take place that fuel this. All of this intellectual genealogy correlates with transformation of other things within society. What I call external identity markers. Why is identity so difficult today for the young people I teach at Grove City College? Well, one of the reasons is the narrative that now grips their imagination that I've just talked about. But what makes that narrative plausible is the transformation of material conditions in which we now live. Thought experiment. I grew up in Gloucestershire, rural part of the United Kingdom, rural part of England. Go back to my village in 1200. If you lived in my village in 1200, spent some time there, and then time traveled forward to 1300, spent some time there, then time traveled forward to 1400 and spent some time there, not much would have changed. 200 years. Your experience there would span 200 years. Very little would have changed. The faces would have changed, but the family names would not have done. The rhythm of life would not have done. The vocations of the various people in the village would not have done. Very little changes in a Gloucestershire village between 1200 and 1400. Now think then about how easy it would be to know who you are in those circumstances. Somebody says to you, "Who are you?" So respond quite simply, "Well, I'm the son of the local blacksmith. Our family lives in that house. That section of the graveyard is where all our ancestors are buried. Oh, that's the font where we're all baptized. that's the church where I got married, or that's the church where I will be getting married, and it's the same church where my parents and grandparents got married. Everything about your identity would be pretty straightforward in that context. Nothing much changes, and everything has an external fixity to it. Even the rhythm of life. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. Think about time. You're almost certainly connected to an agrarian way of life. And an agrarian way of life is a way of life that is determined entirely by the seasons. You cannot get up one morning in the middle of winter and think, I'm going to sow my crops today and harvest them in 6 weeks' time. If you do that, you will die. It is as simple as that. External authority has a huge power and presence because nothing much changes and the seasons grind on from year to year to year. Time, we might say, is authoritative. Space is authoritative. Just as an aside, if you grew up in Gloucestershire in 1300, best guess, you would not travel more than 40 miles from where you were born between the day of your birth and the day of your death. I went on a more epic journey yesterday from Western Pennsylvania to Chicago than most people in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries would have gone on in their lifetimes. In their lifetimes. Think about that. Space, time, these are solid authorities. Why do I throw that in? I arrived in the United States. I'd lived here a bit before in the mid-90s. But I arrived here in the middle of August 2001. You remember the date. It was very interesting to be a foreigner with no real papers in America in 2001 after 9/11 went down. It was a very interesting experience. I'm sure my experience was a lot more pleasant than somebody from another country might have experienced it, but it was still difficult nonetheless. I would say that America has changed more since 2001 than my Gloucestershire village would have changed between 1200 and 1400, maybe even 1500. The advent of the printing press may have made things a little different, but by and large, almost no change, 300-400 years. 23 years in the United States, it's a different epoch when you look back. I have to laugh, by the way. I saw Taylor Swift refers to her tour, latest tour as the Eras Tour. She's what, 34? As I think it was Mary Harrington said, when you're 34, you don't have eras. You have phases. But anyway, it was a different era back in 2001. Social media was not a thing. Smartphones were not a thing. It was a different world entirely. Now think about that. Creates what the German writer Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration. And his argument is that technology speeds things. The printing press speeds stuff up in the late Middle Ages, facilitates the Reformation, the birth of the confessional state, the various things we associate with the 16th and 17th centuries. His point, rather depressingly, is one technological invention transforms Europe, which can only stabilize after about 150 years of bloody religious warfare. Jump to the present day. We get a printing press invented, it seems, every 6 to 12 months. 12 months ago, ChatGPT was not even a thing in higher education. Now it is transforming everything. And Rosa's comment is this, that because we don't have time to assimilate the last technological innovation before the next one comes along, we find ourselves in this vertiginous experience of everything always falling further and further away from us. Life becomes chaos. Think about that, how that plays into identity. From the 16th century onwards, we've had this increasing, we might say, technologically driven social acceleration, which is reaching a peak in our current generation. Where do you look for certainty in that context? Well, you and your feelings become almost the only constant at that point. And you place more and more authority in your own feelings in what is happening. So all of this is to say that intellectual narrative, I've told, correlates with a material narrative. Think about how technology features in this. I want to zero in on this because I think this is something I missed in the two books. It wasn't that I didn't know it was there. I didn't want to write books that were immensely long. You're hard pressed to get somebody to read a 400-page book, let alone a 600-page book today. But I want to talk just briefly here about technology to make us realize that, in a sense, we're all caught up in this. The problem we face, and I try to draw this out in the books, is not that the world around us has been convinced by arguments relative to sexual identity or gender. It's the whole world we live in is in a state of flux and permanent destabilization, which makes the world ripe for all kinds of crazy stuff to grip the imagination. I was aware of gender theory in the 1990s. I dismissed it. Of all the critical theories out there, it struck me, this is the completely bonkers one. Nobody will ever believe this stuff. It's now the normative critical theory out there. It grips the imagination such that if you've been following events in Scotland over the last couple of weeks, you realise that a law in Scotland is about to come into place, which one could summarise by saying, which would make criticism of queer and gender theory basically a crime, a hate crime. Well, how has this come about? I think technology plays its part, and it affects us all. If part of the development of the free, expressive, autonomous self is the result of being freed up from the typical time and space constraints, then technology plays big time into that. Technology has transformed our understanding of time and space. Think of how technology has shattered the authority of time. Here I go to, actually I'm a Reformation guy by background, so we could go to Zurich in 1522. And the beginning of the Zurich Reformation. Slightly embarrassing because it's a few years after the beginning of the Wittenberg Reformation. And Zwingli was always embarrassed that sort of he arrived late in the day, particularly given his later rivalry with Martin Luther. But we could date the beginning of the Zurich Reformation to 1522, and we can actually locate it to a particular place. We can locate it in the printing workshop of Zurich's preeminent printer, Christoph Froschauer, who gathers his men together during the Lenten fast in the presence of preacher at large for the city, Huldrych Zwingli, and they cook a pan of sausages and eat them. Though Zwingli was very careful in his own account of the events to say that he did not partake of the sausage. He was there, but he didn't eat the sausage. Think of what's being done there. On one level, well, they're thumbing the nose at the church. This is Froschauer making the point that we don't follow the liturgical calendar anymore in Zurich. But think of the broader significance of that. I like to say to the students, this is where the modern world collides with the medieval world, and the modern world decisively wins. Think of what's going on there. Froschauer's men are the foot soldiers of the great modern industry of printing. They live in the city, and they are not dependent upon the seasons. They can't have months off in the winter when there's nothing doing because the ground's too hard. Froschauer's men need their carbohydrates and their protein all year round because that's the demand of the printing industry. The old medieval rhythm of time is shattered at that point and in that moment. Often we tend to think of the 95 Theses of Martin Luther as triggering the Reformation. In fact, it's a very medieval document, advertised in a very medieval way by a very medieval man, a friar, working at it's a recent university, but the curriculum is a pretty medieval curriculum. It's a medieval act that happens to trigger the Reformation. Froschauer's act is a very modern act that doesn't just trigger the Zurich Reformation, it shatters the old rhythm of life as well. The rhythm of time is broken. Think about how technology not only frees us from time, it frees us from a connection, immediate connection to nature. Nature in the Middle Ages has a shape. It has a rhythm. Once technology starts to accelerate, that shape and that rhythm become more and more negotiable. The imagination starts to tilt towards thinking of nature as stuff, not nature as having an authority. In almost the only sentences he ever wrote that I remotely understand, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in a very important lecture he gave after the war, The Question Concerning Technology, raises the question of rivers. And he says there is a difference between the man who builds a bridge across a river and the man who dams the river up to generate hydroelectric power. And I think what he's getting at is this. The man who builds the bridge across the river is using technology, but he's using it in a way that sort of respects the shape of nature, respects what the river is. The man who dams the river up for hydroelectric power sees the river just as yet more raw material for doing something completely different with. The modern mentality that technology encourages is to think of nature as raw material. You might say, well, why is that of relevance to anthropology? I would say to you, what is transgenderism? It considers bodies raw material. The body has no integrity in itself. It is merely raw material to be manipulated for the expression of an inner identity. The body becomes instrumental or a tool. We might even put it this way. It ceases to be us and becomes an instrument for the realization of us. I've cited it in lectures before, but there's a fascinating amicus brief in the Dobbs case, the case that led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade a year or two ago. The amicus brief was put together by professional women athletes of the United States of America. It's worth reading. I'm not a lawyer. I cannot possibly parse the legalese for you. What fascinated me about that amicus brief, though, was this. The way those women talked about their bodies. They didn't talk about their bodies as if their bodies were them. They talked about their bodies as the tools of the trade, as I might talk about an overhead projector, or a pen, or a computer keyboard. They didn't think of their bodies as them. That's the technological imagination in action. As technology comes to grip our thinking, so it transforms the way we think about nature and transforms the way we think about our nature. Think of other ways in which technology has fueled this idea of the individual as the autonomous, freely choosing person. I gave a lecture at a Christian liberal arts college a couple of years ago and was tipped off. I called them on the Tuesday because I had this weird, I'm not a charismatic or a mystic, but I had this weird premonition. You're going to be protested this week. So I called the college and I said to the guy who invited me, I'm not going to be protested, am I? He said, oh, no, we don't do that sort of thing here. I arrived at the airport 24 hours later, and as I got in the car, he said, I need to bring you up to speed on something. It has to have been, in all of the great protests of the last few years, it has to have been the most polite and gentlemanly protest ever. The protesting students all turned up for my lecture. They listened politely. They asked me really good questions that actually forced me to think. And then they left to protest me in another part of the campus. But I thought, knowing there was going to be protesters, what I did was I rejigged the order of topics in my lecture. And I started the lecture by saying, okay, I know some of you here, you don't want me on campus. You're here to listen to what I say, but you don't really want to hear what I say. Let's get the most dramatic impact or the most dramatic form of technology for transforming the notion of the self out of the way right at the start. And of course, they were all expecting me to talk about hormone blockers or gender transition surgery. And I said, music. Why do I raise that? I want you to think about this. Think about music. I'm not familiar with every culture in the world, but every culture with which I am familiar has a form of music. Music has been a hardy perennial, it seems, of human existence. Music is has typically been used to mark significant communal events, births, deaths, marriages, parties. People get together, they make music. Music existed to bind people together. Music existed to remind people that they are corporate beings, that I am only me in relation to others. Now think about how technology has transformed music. Up until maybe 150 years ago, if you had wanted to enjoy music, you would either have to make it yourself as part of a group or be present at a corporate gathering where others were making music. Music was a communal production, always. I love music. I'm very eclectic in my tastes. Went to the restaurant last night. It was, I think, Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin. Music to my ears. Could listen to those guys all day long. And I do listen to them pretty much every day at some point. But how do I listen to them? By myself. When Ian Wright drops me off at the airport later today and I get on the plane, I'll be praying that the person next to me does what? Puts their earbuds in as soon as we get on the plane so I can get on with reading my book and I don't have to engage in a conversation that a sort of introverted guy would struggle with. That's what I like. But notice what music's doing there. It's cutting us off from each other. It's isolating us from each other. The very thing that was designed, one might say, to bring us together as a community is now routinely consumed as that which isolates us as individuals, shaping the imagination that we are autonomous individuals, masters of our own destiny. It has gone, as I say, from a matter of communal production to a matter of individual consumption. Man has become, by and large in our modern world, what he chooses. Identity back in that village in the Middle Ages was given. You did not have a choice about your family. We still don't have that, but we can now attenuate family relations rather dramatically. You would not have had a choice probably of career. Born the son of a medieval peasant, you're going to grow up to be a medieval peasant. Born the son of the blacksmith, guess what you're going to be doing in later life? You're going to be a blacksmith. Everything about you was given. Now, think about how we typically identify, we would typically answer the question of who are you? All of us here would answer that question by and large relative to free choices that we've made. Because so little in our life beyond our parentage is actually authoritatively given to us these days. Students at Grove, when I get them to do these sort of thought experiments, and this was something say, well, wouldn't that have been frustrating? And my answer is, well, would it have been frustrating for my smartphone to have been confiscated in 1985? The answer is no. Why not? Smartphones didn't exist as a possibility. It's only when possibilities exist that your denial of your freedom to pursue them is frustrating, I think. Identity now has become a consumer thing. And therein, in some ways, lies the paradox. And I'm going to, drawing this lecture to a close now, I'll take some questions at the end of this. Therein lies the paradox of man. It is man's very freedom to invent himself that has led to his abolition. It is only because human beings can reflect upon their own existence, which is a unique, one might say, godlike capacity, that we can come to the conclusion that we are of no significance whatsoever. It is only human exceptionalism that allows man to make himself unexceptional. So, what have I done in this lecture? What I hope I've done is laid out some principles that I'm going to come back to in the second lecture. We live in an era of anthropological problems. Things are happening round about us very, very fast. Why are they doing so? Partly fueled by technology, partly fueled by the fact that the narrative which this technology is intensifying has been around for several hundred years. How can we stand apart from it? There's a sense in which we cannot do so. We all live in a technological world. We all live in a world where external authority is considerably attenuated compared to that which our ancestors experienced. What are some of the manifestations of this? Well, I would say most dramatically an approach to nature that increasingly sees it as raw material. And that lies at the background of something like transgenderism, or I would argue indeed the sexual revolution as a whole. Bodies become mere tools that can be used in any way that suits us, grants us pleasure, entertains us, without having to respect any kind of moral structure, let alone physical structure, that they have. And this is pressed in upon us even by some of the most routine behaviors today, which we may not even notice, such as the way we enjoy music. That's the bad news. A little bit more bad news to come at the beginning of the next lecture. Then I hope to get to some good news. But I will now take 10 minutes of questions, if anyone has questions. I think there's going to be a roving mic, so do you want me to repeat the question for the... Okay.
With what you've said about the power of technology. But I wonder what you think of the idea that the printing press needed to come into being because the early Reformation, I'm talking about, in Czechia and Poland and England, was creating a thirst to read the Bible. It wasn't the official Reformation, it was a spirit. And so there was a need for people to own Bibles and have Bibles. Could you speak to that?
Great question. If I can, let me know if this is a sort of accurate summary. You're essentially asking whether, is it not, on the one hand, yes, the printing press is disruptive. But is it not the case that the printing press was necessary and indeed a good thing because of the way it essentially made Reformation possible?
It's almost a market analysis, and I hate that. It set up a need to be able to read the Bibles in your own homes because of the stirrings of the Reformation, which, again, had not been clarified yet.
So you're asking, is the printing press itself not a response to a spiritual movement that led to the need for reading Bibles?
What do you think of that?
Yeah, my thought is that's very speculative. I think it would be hard to prove that because I think there are other reasons why people might want to read as well in the 15th century. Development of bookkeeping techniques, for example, the rise of trade, where record keeping is going to be significant, the rise of inheritance and the production of wills, etc. So I think there are various things that one could say might well have provided fertile soil for a social need, a social desire for literacy, or for something like the printing press. Okay. I mean, we know in the Middle Ages books were copied. There was an appetite among some people to read. And that would presumably have placed pressure on, if somebody could come up with what we now think of as the moving type printing press, that solves the problem. So I think there are various things that are going on, of which I'm sure the spiritual desire to read the Bible is would undoubtedly be one of them. But I wouldn't want to reduce it to that.
No. Okay.
I would want to sort of qualify what I said as well. You've given me a sort of opportunity for adding a caveat. I wouldn't want to be seen as saying technology is a really bad thing. What I want to be heard as saying is technology does certain things and creates certain challenges. I do not want to live in a world where we don't have flush toilets, for example, or where we don't have antibiotics. I enjoy living in a technological world. I enjoy, when I'm traveling, being able to call my wife and check in with her in the evening. Technology is, I think, in some ways neither a good thing nor a bad thing. But like all developments, it creates certain opportunities and it presents certain problems and dangers. And being aware of those problems and dangers is important and becoming increasingly difficult to do. You know, this would be another lecture in itself, but the less we have an understanding of what it normatively means to be a human being, the more out of control technology is likely to be. I could have mentioned transhumanism in my lecture here. You know, in the books I deal with transgenderism really as a function of the politics of identity relative to LGB stuff. There is another strand, another way of looking at transgenderism, seeing it as a species of transhumanism, which is a name given to a variety of different approaches, but one thing they share in common is the use of technology to overcome natural human limitations, whether it's seen as mortality, lack of IQ, limitations on physical strength, etc., etc. And that, I think, represents technology run amok. Think of this in the field of medical ethics. If somebody's born with one leg, we have a normative understanding that human beings have two legs. It does not strike me as morally problematic to provide the person with one leg with a prosthetic leg, or if we could develop a robot leg, or a way of growing a leg in a laboratory that we could then stitch onto this person. That doesn't strike me as particularly morally problematic, because it is restoring something that should be there but isn't. If we use technology to give people 3 legs, or 6 arms, or 2 heads, that's problematic because it crashes up against a normative understanding of what it means to be a human being. But if we reject the idea that there is such a thing as a normative understanding of a human being, all bets are off on where technology will take us.
I was curious if you could comment on some of the trend of a more globally connected world. Kind of thinking of Thomas Jefferson thought of towns being limited to 4,000 to 5,000 people because he saw the spread of disease and also degraded morals. So now, kind of taking it, if he was right on that, is there something to be said that as this fast-paced change, we're more globally connected, that while there's been many benefits of that, technology being traded back and forth, that is a positive, but is there also something to be said about some of these ideas that do manifest in ways that are quite contrary to God's design?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're really asking about globalization, good or bad. Is that summarizing your question? It's,
yeah, I think, and especially as it tends towards the trading of these ideas
Yeah.
that are towards transhumanism and the like.
Yeah. I think there are a whole variety of ways one could answer that question. First of all, I think one of the most pressing problems is we have a world, by and large, organized along the lines of the nation state. And nation states require some kind of narrative to hold them together. Nation states are not functions of geography. The person who lives just this side of the US border in Texas probably feels more affinity with somebody who lives in Washington State than they do with somebody who lives 10 miles the other side of the Mexican border. So geography doesn't do it. Nations are an act of the imagination in some ways, and that connects to narratives. This is one of the reasons why I'm an American citizen now, but my heart is really still English in a whole lot of ways. But the 1619 project interests me, not on the grounds of does it have historical integrity or not, but on the grounds that it's gripped the imagination. And when a nation starts struggling with, and I use the word myth here not to say it didn't happen, but just to try to capture how the story grabs the imagination. When a nation struggles with the myth of its own origins, the nation is entering a very dangerous phase of its own identity. And I think what you're pointing to, we have a world organized around nation states that is now subject to a chaos of different narratives. That, well, maybe it will lead, the nation state has no, in my view, no sacrosanct biblical sanction. We haven't always had nation states. So it could pass away and be replaced by something else. The question to me is, can it pass away and be replaced by anything else that's coherent? And that's a difficult question to answer, an impossible question to answer at this point. Maybe it can, maybe it can't, but it's a very worrying stage we're going through. Another way of answering that question would be to say that, what has the internet done? It has totally disrupted and subverted traditional hierarchies of authority. When I've spoken at churches, one of the questions I often get asked by young parents is, what can we do relative to our kids? And my answer's always been, part of my answer has been, well, if you give your kid a smartphone, you're done. Don't even bother sending him to school. Don't worry about whether it's homeschool, Christian school, or public school. If you give him a smartphone, everything else is of irrelevance almost. Why? Because you've allowed some of the most evil people on the face of the planet direct access to your kids. And they will always be more compelling to your kids than you are because you're their parents. So I think there's that dimension to it, that the standard authorities have crumbled in the wake of internet globalization as well. And then you get strange phenomena like when ISIS was at its heyday. I remember reading repeatedly in the British press narratives of young Muslim men who lived in the leafy, wealthy suburbs surrounding London, whose parents were things like surgeons and lawyers. They were very well integrated. We're not talking about people who are on the margins of society because of their race or religion here. Deeply integrated into English society and doing very well. Reading all these stories of young men, and the line was pledging allegiance to ISIS online. That really fascinated me. What has gone wrong that these young men feel more affinity for this, what to them is effectively a make-believe world online, than they do to the communities where, materially speaking, they have everything? And again, I think that's the kind of thing that your question throws up. Got a couple more minutes, take a couple more questions. And somebody adjudicate, there are a number of hands up here. Anybody more worthy than somebody else to ask a question?
This week, the Times of London had an interesting article on English folk in middle age that are more lonely and isolated than ever. I think the Wall Street Journal maybe even had something on that. So going along with manifestations of what you've been talking about, the question then is, out of curiosity, have you picked up on that, and are you doing any research or drawing any connections and conclusions with humanity, anthropology, isolation versus we're made for community?
Yeah. That's more I have a number of colleagues at the Ethics and Public Policy Centre who work on that kind of stuff. And I would recommend that you look, for example, at the work of Mary Rice Hassan, who's done, she's got a lot of statistics on how the sexual revolution in particular has fostered loneliness and things like that. It seems to me to be common sense that if you build your life around a sort of autonomous notion of yourself, you will end up likely dying old and alone. The great poster child for this I use in class is Shulamith Firestone. I cite her in the larger of my two books. She was a radical feminist of the early 70s, quite brilliant woman, Marxist, Hegelian Marxist, anticipating in 1970 that technology could be used to demolish the difference between male and female, that males and females could both give birth. She's visualizing this world where the free, autonomous individual triumphs through technology. Well, when she dies she's Canadian, but she dies in her apartment in Manhattan, I think it is, or Brooklyn, somewhere in New York. They only know she's died because the neighbors smell her body decaying through the floorboards. And I use this as an example. I said, I take no pleasure in telling that story. It's a tragic story that anyone should die like that. But in some ways, it's a sort of appropriate end. For somebody who has simply pressed autonomy to such an extreme, then dying alone and so autonomous that nobody misses you seems to be the logical conclusion. There's a reason why the New York Times, in its disturbingly now regular exaltation of swingers and polyamory, never interviews swingers, or I don't even know what the noun is, polyamorists, I don't know, polyamorous people in their 80s. Because by the time you hit your 80s, if you're pursuing that lifestyle, you're pathetic, obviously pathetic. Case in point, Hugh Hefner. You know, okay, Hugh Hefner in the 1950s looks rather cool with his sailor's hat and his two beautiful women on his arms and his pipe. You know, who doesn't want to be Hugh Hefner, humanly speaking, at that point? By the time Hugh Hefner dies, he's this seedy, slimy old man who's really pretty despicable. I think the philosophy that society is trying to organize itself along the lines of at the moment is a society that is doomed to plunge into fragmentation and loneliness at this point. And that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the church. Because my final point in my second lecture is going to be the church can provide these things that society is not providing. And that's not to say that somebody who comes to church because they're looking for friends, friendship is not the gospel. But it places them in a context where they'll listen to the gospel and take the gospel seriously. I think that we do ourselves no service at all if we simply use what's happening at the moment as a context for lamentation. Lamentation is appropriate, seeing the dehumanization that's going on around us. But I think we also need to realize that it's an opportunity, that we have tremendous opportunities now for conversations that could not have been envisaged 30 years ago. I'm not a big Jordan Peterson fan, but isn't it amazing that somebody like Jordan Peterson is talking about religious things and open to talking to religious people? Still less am I a Russell Brand fan, if you've ever come across that name. But I saw a video this week that Russell Brand is saying, I'm really thinking about Christianity. All the suffering I've had recently has made me realize I need an answer to my suffering. Maybe it'll go nowhere, I don't know. But 20 years ago, Russell Brand would have dripped spittle on any suggestion that he should think about Christianity. So I think there are some great opportunities opening up precisely because of the tragic scenarios that you pointed to. It's 2:00, so we should probably break there for 30 minutes, and then I'll bring you a little bit more bad news and then all the good news in the second half. Well, thanks to Dr. Beach for bringing order to the proceedings. Okay, I laid out in the first lecture, in some ways a significantly chaotic picture, as I try to make the case that really the problems we face today are long-standing and things that take hundreds of years to develop and get a grip cannot be solved overnight with some kind of silver bullet. I think we all need to acknowledge that. And secondly, try to point out that the causes for the situation we find ourselves in are also pluriform. There's no single problem we could say, hey, if we identify that as the problem and we deal with that, we have provided an answer. So I wanted to sort of make the situation as complicated as possible, if you like. In this lecture, what I want to do, though, is suggest that we can actually boil the problem down to a number of key elements or themes. And when we identify these key elements or themes, it then becomes easier for us to think about how to respond. On the one hand, the kaleidoscopic nature of identity politics makes it appear to be, like an octopus. If you grab hold of two of the arms, you've still got 6 other arms thrashing about. But if we can reduce all of the different symptoms that I've tried to identify in the modern world down to a few basic principles, we can start to think how, as churches, we might address those particular issues or problems. And I want to suggest that there are 3 things that mark what I call the anti-anthropology of our day. And those 3 things are this. One of them is the assumption that limits, particularly what we might call natural limits, are problems to be overcome. So the first assumption of our modern anti-anthropology is this: limitations are problems. And that manifests itself in various ways. Second issue, and I think we see this most dramatically in the trans issue, but it manifests itself elsewhere as well, and that is the idea that teleology is something to be rejected. Teleology meaning sort of ends. I'm going to come to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But one of the things that strikes me about the transgender question is that at its heart, it rejects the idea of natural ends. And thirdly, autonomy is asserted over against notions of dependency and obligation. So yes, we have this cauldron of sexual identity politics that grips the modern imagination. But we can identify certain strands within that. One of them is limits of problems. 2, teleology is rejected. And 3, autonomy is asserted over against any claims of dependency and obligation. First of all then, limits of problems. Where do we see this? Well, I could point to various manifestations of this. Perhaps, let's say, in terms of political philosophy, the most obvious manifestation of this is among what we would categorize as liberal and radical feminisms. Liberal and radical feminisms, differing as they do on certain points, share one thing in common. They regard the biological differences between men and women as unfairly providing advantages to men. Most obviously, though not exclusively, this refers to pregnancy. The fact that a woman can get pregnant is seen as something that hinders her over against the lives that men enjoy. I think that underlies the real motive for abortion. For all of the talk about abortion relative to issues of rape and incest, very tragic instances, of course, there's no doubt in my mind that if there was no incest and no rape in this world, people would still demand abortion, precisely because it is not about those things. It's actually about female autonomy and equality with men. And that's what made, particularly in Catholic circles, the development of it's struggling to find a name for itself. But it seems to be settling on sex realist feminism. So interesting. If you've not read Mary Harrington's great book, Feminism Against Progress, well worth getting hold of. Mary Harrington I think she now attends church. She does not profess Christianity as far as I know. But she's a very interesting person in that she lived, I think she got a double first at Oxford in English literature. So intellectually, she's right up there. Lived a very sort of queer existence for the longest time, and then got married and had a daughter. I think there were complications in the birth, so she can never have another child. She begins her book by really doing something very clever. And she says this, when my daughter was born, I could not stop thinking of her as part of my body. Taking the standard feminist trope about babies and abortion, but turning it on its head. Because what she then goes on to argue is, precisely because I could not stop thinking of my daughter as part of my body, I felt obliged to care for her in a more intense way, say, than I would care for my arm. But I would still care for my arm because it's part of my body. It's a very interesting book because she argues there for the importance of human embodiment and the natural obligations that the differences between male and female bodies place upon men and women. As I say, they're struggling, these women, for a term to describe what they are arguing for, but seems to be settling on sex realist feminism. In other words, women who take women's bodies seriously and take their bodies as gifts, not problems. It'll be very interesting to see how this movement develops. But liberal and radical feminisms tend to see pregnancy, and to a lesser extent, but it's still inconvenient, menstruation, as problems that disadvantage women over against men. Secondly, we see limits as presented as problems by pop culture. The standard presentation of sexual mores in pop culture is that it is a cost-free recreational exercise, a denial of what I would say the natural limits and consequences of sexual activity are. When was the last time, well, maybe you don't watch soap operas, but when was the last time you saw a soap opera sitcom where somebody gets divorced and is still scarred by it 6 weeks later? Pop culture tends to preach a myth that sex is a cost-free exercise. Ironically, that's falling apart. The way I get at it in class with students is to say, we know that's not true because we treat sexual assault differently to other forms of assault. If at the end of this lecture you so detest what I say that you come up and punch me in the face, well, 6 weeks down the line that will be a joke. I don't have time to tell you about the time I was held at gunpoint by the Nigerian mafia in Texas for 15 minutes. It was terrifying at the time, but it's a bit of a joke now. I like telling that story because it makes people sit up and listen. But if I'd been sexually assaulted by the Nigerian mafia in Dallas, Texas, I wouldn't make a joke about it because something qualitatively different goes on with sexual assault to other forms of assault. My friend Frank Beckwith, who teaches law at Baylor, has an amazing essay where he gets at this by using Harvey Weinstein as an example. And he says, he'll ask his students, why was Harvey Weinstein such a monster? And the students would respond, say, well, it's because he coerced young women into doing something they didn't want to do for his own sexual satisfaction. And Frank then responds by saying, okay, imagine a scenario where Harvey Weinstein's wife is always too tired to have sexual relations with him at night. So he forces these young starlets into making him dinner on the promise that they will get a part in his movie so that he can sleep with his wife. And Frank makes the point there. They're being forced to do something they don't want to do in order for Harvey Weinstein to get sexual gratification. Is that the same as what he was done for? Of course, the answer comes back, no. So Frank then draws a conclusion. So it's not just they're being coerced into doing something they don't want to do for his sexual gratification. Then he proposes a second scenario. Well, maybe it's because their bodies have been penetrated. But then he'll throw this out. He says, but what if Harvey Weinstein was to say to these young women, I'll give you a part in my movie if you allow me to stick my finger in your ear. And he makes the point. It involves bodily penetration. But, you know, if we heard that story on the news, we might think, that guy's a weirdo creep. But we probably wouldn't think of him as a monster. And then Frank says, why do we think of him as a monster? Because it was sexually penetrative. And Frank uses that as a way to try to get young people today to realize, actually, sexual contact is not like other forms of contact. Sexual contact has a special cachet. I like Roger Scruton's way of expressing it. Roger Scruton makes the point that what sexual assault does is it takes from you something that only you can freely give. And he says, and what is that thing? It is your very self. No other form of assault does that. All of this is to say that sex has limits, and we all know that because of the way laws about sexual assault operate and intuitions about sexual assault operate. But that's not the message that is generally preached by pop culture. Sex is a cost-free recreational activity. We see limits as problems relative to, I think, critical theory. We get into a long discussion about critical theory. One of the things that fascinated me about the discussions about critical theory that emerged in 2020, 2021, 2022 was this. How popular critical theory was on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter, now X, I think. Just as an aside, I'm not quite sure I admire or dislike Elon Musk. He sort of annoys all the right people, which makes me want to admire him. But he's destroying the stick shift motor car, which is a crime against humanity, as far as I'm concerned. My wife only learned to drive in America at 40. She can only drive automatic. I despise automatics, by and large. But the great thing was when my kids were learning to drive, they couldn't drive stick. After they'd passed the test, they couldn't drive stick. So I'd really love to lend you my car. But unfortunately, it's a stick shift, so you'll have to take mums out again. But anyway, back to Twitter. What fascinated me was how critical theory was so popular among people who'd never read a word of it, and yet used it as a kind of shibboleth for who was good and who was bad. Well, if you look at the heart of critical theory, what is it? It's critical. That's what makes it critical theory. It's essentially a means of demolishing limits on the basis that something will arise to replace what's demolished, even though we can't necessarily articulate from our non-utopian perspective what it will look like. And that resonates exactly with expressive individualism. If your intuitions are that the real me is the me inside, and everything that stops me expressing that outwardly is problematic, then you are emotionally akin to a critical theorist. So critical theory, I think, represents, the popularity of critical theory tells us something about the attitude to limits in our society. We could look at the modern anti-hero. I teach a course doing it at the moment on really the significance of certain pieces of 19th century literature for thinking about Christian themes. And two of the authors we look at are Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And what I like about both of those guys is they write incredibly well. I don't think either man wrote a boring sentence in his entire life. And both of them wrestle with the problem really of the anti-hero. The criminal becomes the central character in Nietzsche's philosophy, the transgressor, the one who breaks with the spirit of the herd. And of course, in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky wrestles with the same thing. Raskolnikov is the outsider. In fact, if you've not read the book, the chief of police who ultimately cracks the case is put onto the trail of Raskolnikov because before the murders are committed, Raskolnikov butchers a pawnbroker and her daughter. Before the murders are committed, Raskolnikov has published an article about the genuine person being the one who transgresses, who stands above the law. And that kind of catches the chief of police's eye. Raskolnikov, if you like, writes a Nietzschean essay before Nietzsche, in many ways. The modern anti-hero is somebody impatient of limits. What I love about Dostoevsky, of course, is he demonstrates really the impossibility of living without limits in the end. Raskolnikov has to confess and has to take his punishment. And we see it all around in pressing for iconoclasm and the shattering of limits. Professor Venemer asked me a very interesting question during the break. How do we correlate the sort of radical individualism that I was describing with the emergent totalitarianism, where it's not the case that everybody can be what they want to be. Certain people can be what they want to be. Certain others who disagree with those identities have to shut up or ship out. There are a number of aspects to answering that question. One of them is you can't have a society where everybody does what's right in their own eyes. Somebody has to referee at some point, and what we're seeing in society at the moment is the emergence of the state as the great referee of that. We've lost these sort of mediating organizations that might have done that in the past. But secondly, I think expressive individualism always, even though in some ways it doesn't carry its own morality, it also does carry a morality. It tilts against that which has been traditionally accepted. You're always onto a loser if you hold to a position that has been inherited from the past. It is inherently iconoclastic, and that is impatient with limits. limits are seen as that which has been brought from the past, designed to make us inauthentic in the present. So the first thing then, an impatience with limits. And perhaps the most dramatic example of that, again, is the gender issue. The idea that my body should inhibit or limit my identity in some way is profoundly problematic. Secondly, rejection of teleology. This has numerous sources. In my understanding of science is very, very limited, but it seems from my basic reading of the history of science that the idea of final causes has really dropped out of discussion over the last few hundred years. In the Middle Ages, if you're talking to somebody like Thomas Aquinas, for Aquinas, the final cause would be very important. Anybody drawing on the broad Aristotelian tradition would say, final cause is very important. What a final cause is? Well, even though the word implies they come at the end, which they do chronologically, logically they come at the beginning. When I jump on a plane tonight, we're going to fly to Pittsburgh. The last place I arrive is Pittsburgh. But the first thing the pilot thinks about when he directs the plane as we take off the ground is, where is Pittsburgh? The final cause shapes the whole journey. And for somebody like Aquinas, and indeed for Aquinas' heirs in the Reformation, the final cause of humanity determines everything. Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's a teleological statement. And everything in life is to be judged by whether it advances us towards that end or distances us from that end. Teleology, absolutely critical. But in science, over the last few hundred years, the idea of end causes has really been disappearing. Scientists are still interested in causality, but what we might call efficient causality. The causality that pushes things along without any particular destiny. It's what I think is the most significant contribution philosophically of Charles Darwin. It's not his argument about species and evolution, etc. It's his demolition of the idea of teleology, that the process is not heading in any particular direction. That relativizes human nature more than anything else, I think. So we find it in science, we find it in philosophy. Nietzsche, of course, would regard the assertion of any kind of universal end as fundamentally oppressive. He doesn't even like the language of laws of the universe, because it implies that you could have something that shapes everything else. We see it in culture. When you are your own truth. Oprah Winfrey, thank you very much. And we see it, again, I think most dramatically, in the transgender question. I would suggest to you that the only, well, not the only, but one of the main reasons why the question, what is a woman, is so hard to answer is because we intuitively don't like the idea of final ends, final teleology. I don't know whether you're allowed to have Roman Catholics speak at Mid-America Seminary, but not very far from here is the University of Notre Dame. And at the University of Notre Dame, there is a professor, Abigail Favale, who's written a book, The Genesis of Gender, which I think on the issue of gender is the best thing I've ever read from I wish I'd written it. It's the best thing I've ever read. That was wishful thinking on my part. Best thing I've ever read on gender. Abigail Favale studied gender theory at the highest level and then became a conservative Roman Catholic. And I interviewed her on my podcast maybe 12 months ago. And I opened the question. I said, okay, Abigail, I'm going to ask you a question that seems to perplex the greatest minds of our generation. Wonder if you can give me a handle on this. What is a woman? And without taking a breath, and I summarize her answer here, I think her answer actually took about 2 minutes, but I'll summarize it. Without taking a breath, she said, a woman is a human being whose body is normatively tailored towards gestation. Interesting. Now, the word normative is critical there, because she doesn't want to be taken as saying that women past the age of childbearing, women who aren't married, women who are born without wombs, or with blocked fallopian tubes or no ovaries, are not women. Normative is very important as a term. But then, think about what she's claiming. Normally we would expect that which we call woman to be somebody whose body allows them to conceive and gestate a child. I'm inclined to say, and it really is that simple, isn't it? Why would that be a problem? Why is it offensive to say that? Why are we even trying to eliminate the language of mother? Just as an aside, I've got a couple of friends in the Berkeley area of California, happen to be Muslims. My friend's wife, Sharon, is a midwife. And she's part of a midwife clinic, and I think it's the only one in the area that continues to use the language of woman and mother. They are the only midwife business in the area that's doing well. Surprise, surprise, women don't want to go to a midwife who doesn't believe in women. It's fascinating to me. She was interviewed, I think, by the New York Post. Najib sent me a note about 3 or 4 months ago, say, hey, Sharon's been interviewed in the New York Post, and there she, well, yeah. Saying, yeah, we talk about women. We don't talk about birthing persons. We talk about breastfeeding. And surprise, surprise, this is Berkeley. Imagine this is the belly of the beast as far as gender theory goes. This is where Judith Butler lives. They're going gangbusters. That's an aside. But think about that. Think about teleology. Again, go back to radical and liberal feminisms. If your thinking is that women's bodily functions are things that disadvantage them, then of course you will find that definition intolerable. You will find that definition intolerable. There is a deep connection between teleology and limits, we might say. Again, I commend Abigail Favale to you, and she's just down the road in the University of Notre Dame, a delightful person. She also has a Joan of Arc tattoo on her arm, which is slightly scary, but there you go. The third thing is rejection of dependencies and obligations. And this, by the way, is the last bit of bad news. I'm about to start hitting the more positive, constructive part of the talk. Rejection of dependencies and obligations. That's the natural tilt of expressivism. Rousseau's famous statement is, man is born free and everywhere is in chains. It's complete nonsense. I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. She is almost as dependent on her parents now as she was the day she was born. Unlike hamsters that I used to breed as an obnoxious young teenager, hamsters have to be separated at 21 days because they start to kill each other. If there is such a thing as reincarnation, I'm probably a reincarnated hamster. I like my own company. Hamsters are fully independent at 21 days. They are born more free and less in chains than human beings are. Rousseau, of course, notoriously sent all 5 of his children to an orphanage shortly after their birth. An act, I would suggest, of infanticide in the 18th century. Why did he do that? Well, children are not a gift to which we have obligations and in which we should rejoice. They're links in a chain. They're links in a chain in Rousseau's philosophy. It's the natural tilt, if you like, of expressivism to see other people in instrumental terms. Do they enhance my happiness or do they detract from it? And my relationship to them is built upon that criterion. We see it also, interestingly enough, in some of the legal shifts in this country. Can't go into detail, but I would recommend that you look at the work of Helen Alvarez at the Scalia School of Law in DC. Helen is a Roman Catholic professor of law, works significantly in the area of family law, and has traced what I think she would call the sort of the functional definition of parenting emerging in American law. What do I mean by that? That parents are increasingly identified by what they do rather than who they are. And when you start to think that way, you can start to say, well, a parent who does not affirm the gender identity of their 7-year-old child is no longer a parent. There is no natural relationship there that brings with it obligations and dependencies. It's merely a construct. And we could also add technology to this again. What does technology do? Technology allows us to imagine we can live without consequences. And when consequences appear, we think of them as bugs in the system, not part of the design. Particularly applies to sexual ethics, I think. My son was driving to the airport in Philadelphia the other week. I'd never seen a sign for this before, but there was a big sign. And the word on this sign in giant letters heading towards the airport was syphilis. And when I read the smaller print underneath, it was giving you clinics you could call if you got syphilis. Syphilis, direct function, of course, of promiscuous sexual behavior. It doesn't mean that everyone who's got syphilis has behaved inappropriately. Somebody's wife could have picked it up from a husband who hasn't behaved appropriately. But it's a function of a society where morals have been dismissed and sex is thought of as a cost-free exercise. And if problems occur because of that, the answers are always technical, not moral ones. It's not a question of changing your behavior. It's a question of getting the right antibiotic. So rejection of dependencies and obligations. Okay, let's come to the positive, constructive side of this then. How does this help us think about a church strategy relative to this stuff? Well, here I'm going to adapt a quotation from the late great Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen. The obvious answer to these problems is that if the church does not find her hearers inhabiting a world of limits, teleology, obligations and dependency, then the church herself must be that world. Let me repeat that. The obvious answer is if the church does not find her hearers inhabiting a world of limits, teleology and obligation/dependency, that's me, not Robert Jensen, those three clauses there, then the church herself must be that world. If the problems I've highlighted are problems of the whole person, problems that grip the imagination, then the church has to think about how do we address that in our regular ministry and life. And I want to say we do that in three spheres. If I was an Anglican, I would say creed, code and cult. Nice alliteration there. Cult, kind of a bad word though. So let's say teaching, worship and behavior. All three, I think, need to be in place. Let's think then about how my analysis might shape how we think about these things. First of all, creed. Well, always, what does the church have to do? The church always has to teach the whole counsel of God. I noticed that I've been provided with a copy of the Heidelberg Catechism to prop up my notebook this time round. I wondered what the book was when it was slowed there. Looked like an old copy of Honest to God by John Robinson that I own, but thankfully it is not Honest to God by John Robinson. Heidelberg Catechism, divided 52 Lord's Days. It's no surprise to you. Why is it? The idea is that you get through the whole counsel of God on a regular basis. That's true, but I want to suggest that some doctrines become of more pressing importance at particular points in time. And I think creation is the doctrine of our day that we perhaps need to think about more deeply than we may have done in the past and teach more proactively and intentionally upon. By creation, I'm not particularly thinking here of, the timetabling, the usual kind of questions that come up. I'm thinking about the significance of creation for how we think about ourselves as human beings, particularly the significance of the material creation for how we think about ourselves as human beings. So that's the first thing I want to say. We have to make sure that our teaching is addressing broadly the problematic underpinnings of the three things that I've talked about. If you're teaching properly on creation, you will naturally start talking about limits and teleology. In fact, I think limits and teleology are almost two sides of the same coin. And you will start talking about dependencies and obligations. And I think much of that will actually flow out of teaching on the importance of the human body. It is interesting. I think the most disturbing thing to me about COVID was not that churches went online. I think, in the first couple of weeks when, is it the bubonic plague or a third of the population going to die, it seemed to me to be prudent to take some kind of precautions at that point. What struck me was how few Protestants thought that much was being sacrificed by doing that. It's kind of, okay, I don't mind people doing that, but at least feel that it's horrible and painful to do it. That something important has been lost. There is a tilt in Protestantism with its, I think, right and appropriate emphasis upon the preached word in our technological world to start thinking that the preached word is something we can consume in the privacy of our own homes. That's a problematic assumption. And it's not easy to combat if you're not teaching people on why it's important we have bodies. Why it's important, I might put it better, we are bodies. Secondly, last time I was here, Dr. Beach reminded me last night that I got into a long discussion with a former professor about redemptive historical preaching. Well, I'm going to put my foot in the hornet's nest again and say, and in fact, I think I'm going to say pretty much the same thing as I said last time, with maybe an I told you so sort of added to it. I like redemptive historical preaching. I do appreciate sermons that don't dare me to be a Daniel, or dare me to be a David and identify the stones with different things, but use David as a pointer to Christ. But what I would suggest is this. You need practical application. And you actually need it now more than ever. I would say that if you do not connect the dots for your congregation, particularly for your young people, they will not connect the dots for themselves. And they're facing a very different world to the world, thankfully, that I grew up in. I taught for 8 years, secular, 8.5 years, secular universities in the UK. I was in both places the most conservative theological person on the faculty, and nobody cared, as long as I taught church history well. I doubt that I could get a job at a university today, not because I'd become a much worse teacher, but because a whole host of other questions would be asked of me that have nothing to do with my competence in the classroom and everything to do with the political views I hold. Young people today are living in a very different world. They're going to be facing questions, even when they go to grad school, of, what happens when I'm asked to specify my pronouns? Should I do that? What about my coworker who wants me to use their chosen pronouns? There are all kinds of questions coming up that I would say the Bible does have an answer to, but does not have an obvious answer to. It's the task of the pastor to teach his people to be able to handle these difficult questions as and when they come. And that requires connecting dots. And I would use a historical precedent for this. I was thinking, are there historical precedents for this? Well, go back to the impact of the printing press in the 16th and 17th centuries and the rise of that first-person pronoun. It also corresponds with the rise of cases of conscience. It's actually the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, who sort of pioneer this. And then the Puritans get hold of it. Cases of conscience, books that deal with specific moral problems that individuals find in real life, guiding those individuals how to think about the issues. Actually, there's a slightly naughty history of cases of conscience, because we now know that some Puritans basically plagiarized Jesuit handbooks, removed the bits about the Pope and Mary, and passed them off as Protestant theology. In fact, I think in one case, the plagiarist may then have been involved in hunting down and prosecuting the Jesuit who wrote the very book that he plagiarized. So sort of the dark history of Protestant casuistry. But think about today. A host of questions that young people face, that simply telling them where Jesus is in the Old Testament text, that's a great thing to do, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. Most of us in this room grew up in a world where we were privileged that, I might say, the ethics of the world around and the ethics of Christianity weren't so different that the world didn't basically do the heavy lifting for us in teaching our kids how to think and behave. That's not the world that our kids are growing up in today. There's more heavy lifting that the church has to do. Now you might say, well, I can never do that from the pulpit. We'll do it in Sunday school then. Your church has got to do it somewhere. Or I would suggest to do not be upset and angry with your young people when they consistently make the wrong decisions with some of these very complicated ethical questions that will be demanded of them in the workplace and in their neighborhood. So teaching. Secondly, worship. And here I'm struck that, the problem, if the problem of the modern self is, I use this term in the book, if it's a problem of the social imaginary, if it's a problem of the intuitions, we've internalized the way the world thinks around us and we intuitively think about ourselves and the world around us. If the problem is our intuitions, then teaching alone is not going to solve the problem. Put this way, the imagination has to be gripped. And that's where I think worship comes in. Very struck at Grove. It's been fascinating going back to teaching undergraduates after 17 years away from it. A lot of our young people at Grove, they're great young people, and many of them come from what I would describe, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, because I believe that many of their home churches have taught them well, and the pastors have cared and loved for them, come from what I would call big box evangelical churches. And what's interesting to me is how many of them go to the local Anglican church, which is it's a great church. The pastor there's a good friend of mine, he's a good preacher. And I'll ask them, why do you go to the Anglican church? You came from Calvary Chapel, but now you're at the Anglican church. That's a bit of a leap. Why do you do that? The answer is usually twofold. One of the answers will be, Pastor Ethan is just a great guy. He's a lovely preacher, and he's always got time to talk to me. And that's a great answer. The other answer is the liturgy. Suddenly Christian worship has a meaning for me that I never saw it have before. Gave a lecture about 2 years ago now. That was a discussion panel. And it wasn't in a particularly Christian setting, but somebody asked a question at the end. They asked me, they said, I go to a church where the worship service, I always remember the way he described it, he said, the worship service, it's like a TED talk followed by a Coldplay concert. I think I know exactly what he means. He said, what should I do? And every fibre in my being wanted to say, get out of there as quickly as possible. But I'm sure that the pastor is cared for. I'm not in the business of dissing other people's pastors. And I said, well, maybe you should talk to the elders of the pastor and suggest better ways. But it struck me that, what does liturgy do? Liturgy does a number of things. But one of the things is, of course, it makes us feel our limits. You may not have thought of it that way. But if you have a formal liturgy, or even if you just sing hymns or psalms, there's a corporate limitation that kicks in at that point. First of all, it's actually returning music to what it was meant to be. Binding a community together to celebrate or to reflect upon something serious and very human. But secondly, it demands discipline. It's not scat singing. When you're at a standard worship service, even I suspect a TED talk followed by a Coldplay concert, you're not doing what's right in your own eyes. You're having to coordinate with other people. It has a limiting effect. It shapes the way you think about yourself and about the people you are around. I didn't use this earlier, but I'll use it now. Think about dancing. Not advocating dancing in worship at this point, by the way. But think about dancing. There is the dancing of Mr. Darcy in the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice, and there's the dancing of John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. In between the two, you have the development of the waltz and the foxtrot. Dancing, too, is a story of the rise of individualism. Mr. Darcy has to obey the rules of the game in order to impress and make sense. John Travolta just has to strut his stuff better than the other guy in order to make sense and impress. Corporate activities like singing or the recitation of a liturgy quietly remind us of our dependence upon other people. I would also suggest that good liturgies should have a teleology built into them. If you read good liturgies, good historic Christian liturgies, you may not agree with the theology, but if you were to read the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, or you were to read the liturgy of the traditional Mass, or you were to read the Book of Common Prayer's communion service, you see there's a teleology. Everything's moving towards an end. Every element is shaped by the end. There is a reason that Vespers, I think I'm right in saying, in the Anglican, Catholic and Orthodox churches, Vespers end with the recitational singing of the Nunc Dimittis. Now you're dismissing your servant in peace. Why? Because you've met with God. You've met with God, and now you're prepared to die. There's a teleology there. And you might say, well, it's a bit much, isn't it, to think that this will, have an impact. Well, I would suggest this will have an impact incrementally over the years on people. The analogy I use, I did classics at university. I don't remember a single Latin lesson I took at school. I remember the Latin master. I don't remember a single Latin lesson. But I must have been there because I went on to do classics. I must have learned Latin somewhere down the line. The effect of those lessons did not depend upon me remembering those lessons. The effect of those lessons depended upon the incremental transformation of me over the 5 or 6 years I was at grammar school. That, I think, is what the rhythm of the worship service should do to people. It incrementally transforms people. It incrementally prepares us to die, one might say. So there should be a teleology there. And again, I think this answers some of the problems. Think of the psalmist in Psalm 73. I reread it again this morning just to make sure that I was remembering the right psalm. The psalmist is wrestling there with the meaninglessness of existence and the fact that wicked people live these long, prosperous, happy lives and good people die young. And he says, my feet had almost stumbled. Very strong language. And he essentially says, none of it made sense until I went to your sanctuary. And then I saw their end. It was we might say, it was going to where God was present with his people, brought teleology to bear on the moment in which he found himself living. Well, our equivalent to that has got to be the worship service, I think. Have you ever thought that, the way to get people to make sense of their suffering may not be simply to point them to God's sovereignty in a one-to-one conversation, but to have them in a worship service? That was certainly Luther's antidote to those who struggle to pray. Get to a worship service. And then finally, and I hope both of those two things, both of those two things are well within the capacity of any church. You don't need $1 million budget to teach properly and to have a decent liturgy. That's pretty cheap stuff, actually, by and large. And thirdly, I think the embodied... this is part of worship. Embodied worship is important as well. I'm going to abbreviate this because of time restraints. But again, it goes back to the difference between, say, virtual versus actual worship. I found myself, Grove City, on a panel a couple of years ago with the local Eastern Orthodox priest. And one member of the audience said, "What do you think about virtual worship?" And the Eastern Orthodox priest grabbed the microphone and he said, "Virtual worship is not worship." And then he passed me the microphone. It's just as simple as that to him. Well, think about that. I mean, for him, there are all kinds of sacramental reasons for that. The obvious theological underpinnings that I could not share. But it struck me he has a point. Now, don't get me wrong, online streaming of services might be very helpful for those that we have an elder, a retired elder at the church I'm at in Grove City now, who can't get to church on a Sunday due to severe ill health. And I think it's great that he and his wife would be able to sort of tune in and see what's going on and keep up with what's going on. But it's not as good as the real thing. And it certainly shouldn't be normative for some able-bodied person who can get to church. Because embodiment is important. And we all know that being present with somebody bodily is often so much more significant, always so much more significant than being virtually present with them. I speak to my mum on the phone every Sunday, maybe every other Sunday. It's great to be able to talk to my mum. It's not as good as being able to sit in her front room when I visit her in the summer and actually share a pot of tea with her and be physically present. We need to think about the worship services, reminding people that they are bodies as well. And that brings me then to my final point, code or behavior. Two elements here I want to just throw out. And I'm conscious here I'm moving into territory that may look different in different places. these things may look different in Manhattan to the way they do in rural Western Pennsylvania. But I think two things that the church needs to think about cultivating are friendship and hospitality. A couple of years ago, I had an interesting conversation with a Young Life worker. A number of the young people at Grove City College, they work with Young Life in the local high schools. And one of their sort of bosses was visiting, and he just popped in to say hi, and we were chatting, sharing a cup of coffee. And he was telling me, he said, you know, among the 13-year-old girls at the school where I'm working, he said 80% of them identify as lesbian. And I said, well, wow, that's, you know, even by today's standards, that's sort of way out of all proportion to what you would expect. So I said, you know, well, why do you think that's the reason? And he said, well, a couple of things. He said, one, we're in this kind of odd situation where it's not cool to be straight. So, you know, whereas in my day, it would have been, a grammar school, it would have been very uncool to have said you were gay. Now it's sort of pretty uncool to say you're straight. So there's a certain social pressure on. But he said the other thing is, and this I think was a more significant comment in terms of what we can do. He said the other thing is, he said, young people don't know what friendship is. I thought that was very insightful. Because what he was essentially saying this, you know, young girls, 13, 14, 12, 13, 14, maybe they're going through puberty, chaos of emotions. Like a lot of young teenagers, guys as well, they develop strong and passionate friendships with people of the same sex. In my day, they'd just have been strong friendships. In our world, the only category, the only lens we give young people for understanding such strong feelings is a sexual one. So they interpret their feelings relative to the framework provided for them by the wider sexualized society in which we live. Now, that was his speculation, but it strikes me as a profoundly plausible piece of speculation. Profoundly plausible. We've lost the category of friendship. One of the things we need to do in our churches is provide young people with models of friendship. That we can be passionate about each other, if you like, without that being in any way an inappropriate thing. One of my guilty pleasures, I love reading John Henry Newman. He's just such a great writer. His theology is a bit askew at a lot of points, but such a great writer. Actually, his Christology, his sermons on Christ are quite fantastic. But his Catholic distinctives, no, I'm not on board with those. But I love reading Newman because he writes so beautifully. He's one of the greatest prose writers of the 19th century. And he's one of the greatest letter writers of all time. And one of the interesting things is he writes letters to his friend, a fellow priest, Ambrose St. John. Very close to Ambrose St. John. If you read those letters today, you'd think he was gay. But he isn't. He wasn't. He was just expressing himself in the typical idiom of a Victorian man for a male friend. This odd thing about English society that Englishmen were very reserved, face to face and in public, and very passionate in their letters. Ambrose St. John was his friend. And that's something I think that the church needs to recapture if it wants to help our young people stop thinking about themselves in exclusively sexual terms. Again, isn't it interesting? I would bet Charles Haddon Spurgeon, when he preached on the friendship of David and Jonathan, never had to start his sermon by saying, by the way, this is not a gay relationship. When I preached on that a few years ago, that was the first thing I said. Why? Because that's the world we live in now. You have to explain friendship to people, that it isn't something that is necessarily sexual or inappropriate. So, modeling friendship. So I was talking to students this week and saying, don't confuse college chapel with church. College chapel, it can be great to go and hear good speakers. Sing God's praise. I'm not one of these ones to say going to chapel is sinful. But I said there are various things you can't get from chapel. Lord's Supper, etc., etc. But one of them is this. You don't get that intergenerational mix that allows you to see how husbands and wives of many years interact with each other. How friends interact with each other. Mature people interact with each other as friends. Church, I think, is very important from that perspective. And secondly, And I would say, oh, by the way, I'd also say, God, it's not insignificant that God speaks to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. It's not insignificant that Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. Seems to me friendship is an important biblical category. It has theological grounding. Secondly, hospitality, which again has biblical grounding. I am the God of the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. God is a hospitable God, we might say. Hospitality is critical. I use myself as an example of this. Why am I a Presbyterian? I might say it's because of the plain teaching of the Word of God. But I would not be being entirely honest if I just gave that answer. I'm also Presbyterian because my first weekend in Aberdeen as a postgraduate, I was lodging at the house of somebody I discovered was an elder of the Free Church of Scotland, and I felt obliged to go to his church on my first Sunday in town. So I went to his church, and the woman in front of me, a little old lady whose name I still remember, Effie Morrison, at the end of the service turned round and said, do you have anywhere to go for lunch? And I was all on my own, I knew nobody, and I said no. And she and her husband had me home for lunch. That's nearly 40 years ago, 36 years ago that would be. I still remember her name. It made a huge impact on me, and it massively, positively disposed me towards Presbyterianism. I had another experience just last year. I was asked to go and give a speech, it was in London, an after-dinner speech at a club in London. And the secretary was a Christian, and he said to me when he contacted me, he said, I noticed you taught at the University of Nottingham in the early 90s. I taught there too, but I don't think we ever met. And I responded, I said, did you drive a red sports car? And he said, yes. And I said, we met. And he said, when did we meet? I said, first Sunday, I was in Nottingham, starting my job as a lecturer at the university. My wife was in Scotland, teaching out a teaching contract. I came to your church, and I sat behind you. And at the end of the service, I was on a lucky run, actually, of these things. You turned around and said to me, do you have anywhere to go for lunch? And I said, no. And you took me home for lunch. It interested me that he didn't have a clue who I was. He didn't remember me at all. And that's because I imagine he's given hospitality to hundreds of people over the years. But you never forget the name of the people who gave you hospitality when you need it. Or at least you shouldn't if you have an ounce of gratitude in your body. I think hospitality is key. Yeah, the modern self is a massive intellectual problem and enigma. But I think hospitality is part of the answer. Think about it. One of the qualifications of eldership is hospitality. If you're not a hospitable person, you're not qualified to be an elder. That's the New Testament teaching on that. Hospitality. And I think elders, of course, are meant to represent in their life what is to be the aspiration for all Christians. I disagree with those who say the standards for eldership are incredibly high. I don't think it's incredibly high to say somebody, they shouldn't get drunk. They should be of good reputation with their neighbours. They should be married to one woman. Those strike me as remarkably easy things to achieve if you put your mind to them. What an elder is to be, well, he's to be that guy in the church that when your young people say to you, or your child says to you, what should I be like when I grow up? You point to the elder and say, you want to be like that guy. He doesn't get drunk. He's married to one woman. His household is in order. He's a godly guy. He's hospitable. So I want to end by saying, I think there are practical things here. Not everybody has the intellectual capacity to combat the intellectual enigma that is the modern self. But everybody has the capacity to model friendship and to be hospitable. And I think those things are as important to solving the problem of the modern self as anything. And I think it's striking to me, in a world, which one of the questions in the first half alluded to, in a world of fragmentation and loneliness, that's a kind of message that gets you a hearing, actually. I mentioned Russell Brand. I don't know if Russell Brand will end up being a Christian or not, but it fascinates me that out of the wreckage of his life, he's at least wrestling with the demands of Christianity at this point. Maybe it will go nowhere with him, I don't know. But that wouldn't have happened 10, 20 years ago. One of the great advantages of the modern self is this. Stuff's falling apart. And that gives us tremendous opportunities for great conversations And in a world where people are struggling to belong, the church can be a great place to belong. Thanks very much for listening so patiently. I have to dash to the airport fairly shortly, but maybe 5 minutes of questions. Does that work? Take 2 or 3 questions? Okay.
So I apologize, but I do have a question about genealogy, which I know you, but the question is, in what way, if at all, has the Christian tradition itself informed and influenced the modern sense of self? Think about, I was reading Bart recently talking about how much he appreciated the 17th and 18th century hymns, but also how heavily individualistic they are. And you think about pietism and mysticism, and even Augustine, his Confessions is filled with I language, like you were talking about.
Well, first of all, before I answer that question, just a little sort of pre-answer is, I don't think expressive individualism is entirely wrong. I alluded to the importance of empathy when I was talking about Rousseau earlier. I also think we do have individual feelings. We would be lying to ourselves if we thought that our feelings were not an important part of us. Now, it's interesting you raise Augustine, because Augustine is, the Confessions is the great psychological autobiography. But to me, it's very much a psychological autobiography along the lines of Psalm 73. The whole thing is cast as a prayer. So Augustine certainly expresses his feelings, but constantly brings them under the external authority of the revealed God. Psalm 88 would be another example. It's a psalm of abject despair in many ways, but it begins with the covenant name of God. So all of those feelings are expressed under the authority of God. So this is a roundabout way of coming to sort of answer your question and saying, expressive individualism, it certainly captures something perhaps that was missing before. I might say, what does the Reformation do? Well, in some ways, the Reformation shatters the authority of the church. And it tilts the church towards being a consumer product. But on the other hand, it recaptures the existential urgency of the need for faith that was really missing in the Middle Ages. There's much I admire about medieval theology. One thing I don't admire about it is its lack of existential urgency. Secondly, Christianity's never been separate from these modern developments. I didn't allude to it in the book, but isn't it fascinating that Rousseau is writing his stuff at the same time as Jonathan Edwards is writing Religious Affections? They're both wrestling with, what do we do with the inner space? What authority do we grant inner feelings? Now, I do think that pietism represents too much of a tilt in the wrong direction. The worst offender is, I used to have a fundamentalist secretary when I was at Westminster, and this was her favorite hymn, and I used to tell her, it's nothing but German liberalism. Those ask me how I know he lives within my heart. What absolute rubbish. Does that mean if he doesn't live in my heart tomorrow, he's not living anymore? That's German liberalism, I would say to her. She got very annoyed at that. She didn't take it very positively at all. But I think there is that danger of an I, me, mine emphasis. But just because something tilts towards excesses doesn't mean that it doesn't have real insight. So I still want to say Protestantism has to be part of the solution rather than the problem. There are bugs in the system. There are things we need to be aware of that we need to guard ourselves against. But on the whole, I want to say it's Calvin rather than Thomas Aquinas on the issue of salvation for me, or Luther rather than Thomas Aquinas. But certainly, we need to be aware. The first question we always need to ask, anything like this, which is perhaps more and more difficult as society gets polarized and politicized, is it I, Lord? We have to be careful that we don't default into, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men, like these expressive individualists over here. And then we go off and sing a song about, we know Jesus lives because he lives in my heart. So I think being aware of the problem is not the full solution, but is the beginning of the solution.
Do you think, given your conception of the future church, do you think that it would be necessary to break away from evangelicalism, given what little it has to offer in regards to the teaching and worship aspect?
Yeah, I'm always wary of questions about evangelicalism because I'm never quite sure what it means. I know what it means back home in the UK. It means J.I. Packer, and I'm right there. Over here, it's a kind of more, it's more almost a sociological term at times. But let's just, for the sake of argument, if we would say something like Calvary Chapel or your typical Southern Baptist church. I would say I don't want to break with people like that. I want to affirm good Christian people everywhere as brothers and sisters. What I'd like to try to do is teach them, without being patronizing, teach them a better way. And there again, I think the times are auspicious on that front. When I wrote the Creedal Imperative 12 years ago, it was hard to persuade the 10-point church that they needed 11 points. Then gay marriage comes along. And suddenly all these churches are finding they're having to produce statements on gay marriage. And they're beginning to realize that actually it would be really helpful to have a more comprehensive statement of faith. Maybe not that every member has to believe, but certainly every minister and elder has to uphold. Well, it sounds very like Presbyterianism to me. And so I think the times are auspicious for saying, given the pressure that's coming, given the complexity of the questions, particularly young people are now being asked by the culture around, the case for creeds seems to me to be much more easy to make now than it was back then. So I don't want to break with evangelicalism so much as say to individual evangelical churches and friends, let's talk. Maybe there are things I can learn from you, but what I want to teach you is about creeds, confessions, and how they can help you at this point maintain the faith amidst all the chaos that's around us. Yeah.
Just a
I'm not
quick.
sure that's on actually. It's kind of simple to hold, but
It's
not
recording for the other.
It's
yeah,
recording
so
to there.
yeah,
Okay.
we have two systems.
So I appreciate the gesture, but it doesn't make much difference.
My question is about, you were talking about limits and seeking to transcend limits and how that's a cultural thing. I was wondering, and you mentioned this in your first lecture a little bit, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to those who have more, like, what's the difference between, like, where is the line between trying to exceed natural limitations and trying to exceed what I would call providential limitations?
Right.
Where, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, you're asking the question that I always dread being asked because I can't really give a straightforward answer to it. But, is it shattering of natural limits that yesterday I got on a plane and traveled to Chicago in an hour and 16 minutes rather than walking it over a period of 3 days, 4 days, a week, something like that? Am I dehumanized by that? Is that the kind of question you're asking?
I was more asking, that is definitely helpful, but I was more asking people who are handicapped. Maybe,
Okay.
Like in different ways, not
Okay.
just like physically, but just in general. In what ways, like seeking to further your situation, but also the airplane one would be helpful too.
Yeah. Well, I think the airplane one points us to the fact that there are grey areas here. It's one thing to talk about technology transgressing limits and dehumanizing us. Actually establishing that with precision is a very, very difficult task. Now, I'm prepared to say that taking somebody with the body of a man and trying to turn them into a woman, that's dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. Where does restorative surgery end and transformative surgery begin? Maybe there's a grey area there. I remember talking last year to a friend, a PCA pastor friend, whose granddaughter has Rett syndrome. And we were talking about genetic modification. And his comment to me was, if you could develop a pill tomorrow that I could give to my granddaughter that would restore what is missing and give her a normal, happy life, I would take it. And I responded, I said, and I have no problem, even though I was at that point pressing against genetic monkey business, I said I would have no problem with that because it's restorative. We have a normative understanding of what a human being should be, and that pill would restore that which is missing, not turn her into something that isn't human. But where restorative ends and transformative begins, there could be some grey areas there. Some cases are obvious, others I think would require considerable thinking. In terms of handicapped people, again, there are these interesting movements among the deaf community against cochlear implants. Because the idea is that actually if a deaf person has a cochlear implant, they lose something. They actually lose something that their deafness they feel has given them. Again, those are difficult kind of questions. One thing I think that we need to remember is that handicap of any kind does not reduce the humanity of a person. Humanity is not connected to the perfection of our bodies or our chromosomes. Humanity is connected to the fact we're made in the image of God. So that's the sort of answer I would give to that. And all this is to say, there are some really complicated issues there that I'm not competent to parse. And of course, they become more complicated by the day because technology provides us more and more possibilities for transformation.